Hello history fans and welcome back to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. Today I wanted to chat about Queen Anne because I've never really known much about her. But after watching The Favourite, that film with Emma Stone and Olivia Colman, I was intrigued about her life and I wanted to know a little bit more. And I finally got around to researching, so this is a brief insight into the life of Queen Anne. Before we get into it though, if you're watching the video, please like and subscribe to the channel if you're new, and if you're listening, follow the podcast and leave a rating. Thank you. This is also not a time period I'm too familiar with, as you'd guess, since we mostly talk about ancient history over here on the podcast. So I had to really Google things like, what's a Jacobite? So yeah, there's not loads of detail in this. It's just a little brief summary of her life. But then equally, if you don't know much about this time period, you've come to the right place. So Queen Anne was the daughter of James II. She was queen from 1702 to 1714, meaning she was the end of the Stuart dynasty, and laid the path for the Georgian era. She's often overlooked, maybe because the image that the film The Favourite painted, but Anne was a dedicated queen, assertive when she needed to be, despite being famously shy, and a strong stateswoman who endured lots of ill health during her lifetime. Short and sweet TikTok style summary over, let's get into some detail. Anne was born on the 6th of February 1665 to, eventually, the King James II, and Anne Hyde. It wasn't expected that she would ever be queen, as she was only the niece of King Charles II, as her dad James was Charles's younger brother. So she's educated enough for a woman of her standing and pretty happy not expecting to rule the country. Even though her dad James was a Catholic, she and her older sister Mary were raised Protestant. Dun dun dun. So she had a strong loyalty to the Church of England. Just for context as to why this is important, we're not long after the religious turmoil that the Tudors caused at this point. So your denomination of Christianity is very important and can determine how your reign will go. So as you'd expect of the time, her early life was involved in the politics of the royal succession and the religious conflicts surrounding it. After her mother died when Anne was 6, her father remarried Mary of Modena in 1673, reaffirming his allegiance to the Roman Catholic religion, which really confused me as to why she would have still been raised Protestant then. Well, it was because her uncle, King Charles II, had said that Anne and her sister Mary were to be raised Protestants. This was because James being heir to the throne and Catholic wasn't a great thing for the royal family, and when Charles died and James becomes king, his attempts to increase the Catholic Church's power were not well met by a lot of people, including Anne, who became estranged from her father from her father. I don't know. Anyway, rewind. Most of her childhood was spent in France, where she was being treated for an eye problem, but she did still have poor eyesight for the rest of her life, sadly. Nevertheless, her French was good, which came in handy when dealing with foreign ambassadors as queen. It's said that Anne's nature was quiet and shy, so she valued her close and loyal friends. In letters, she begged Lady Sarah Churchill to always be by her side, and her sister Mary was similar, writing to Lady Frances Apsley as her husband. Sarah Churchill came from a gentry family, first coming to court as maid of honour to Mary of Modena, in 1673, which is where she met her husband, who will later be important, John Churchill. He was a page to King James II, so they married in secret, but they managed to climb back up the social hierarchy to Duke and Duchess of Marlborough in 1702, thanks to John's military successes and Sarah's allegiance to Anne. Things carry on for a while. Then 1677, her sister Mary married William of Orange, Stadtholder of Holland, which is like a duke. So she moved away, but that did help the European connections. In 1681, after George Ludwig, later King George I, visited England, it was suggested that Anne should marry him, since it was such a politically suitable match. But it was not to be. Both Charles and James did not approve the match. Instead, in 1683, she married Prince George of Denmark, who was not overly popular and reputedly dull. Charles II apparently once said, "I have tried him drunk, and I've tried him sober, and there's nothing in him." But Anne came to love him, and unusually for royal couples at the time, they regularly shared a bed. But they had a lot of tragedies, losing 18 children to miscarriage, stillbirth, early death, and 2 daughters under the age of 2 who died of smallpox within just days of each other. William, Duke of Gloucester, was born in 1689 and did survive infancy, a relief to Anne, who was dependent on an heir for the Stuart dynasty. Controversy then struck in 1688 when Anne's stepmother, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a boy, meaning Mary and Anne were now after this baby boy in line for succession. James I had magically now had a male heir, so rumours spread that the baby was an impostor, smuggled into the bedchamber in a warming pan to release a stillborn baby boy. That's a horrific rumour, I know, but even Anne never accepted the baby as legitimate, and James Francis Edward Stuart became known as the Old Pretender. At this point, like I mentioned before, Anne and her father were not really friends, so her not accepting this new heir makes sense in the atmosphere of the time. Also in that year, Mary's husband, or Anne's brother-in-law, William of Orange, was convinced to invade England with a group of English statesmen, and, encouraged by Lady Sarah Churchill, Anne supported him against her father. James II was deposed and fled to exile in what was called the Glorious Revolution, so Mary and William became joint sovereign, and Anne became heir if they didn't have children. But James still had support from those Jacobites. Taken from his Latin name Jacobus, these supporters, mainly in Scotland I think, believed that James shouldn't have been deposed, and that the following succession was illegitimate because monarchs were appointed by God or divine right, so couldn't be removed by some invader. So Mary and William are now on the throne, and Sarah's influence over Anne started to grow, which caused a rift between Anne and her sister, Queen Mary. In 1691, Anne suggests that her and Sarah call each other Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman in their letters, so they're equals, not a princess and her lady. One letter from Queen Anne to Sarah in 1692 said, "I'd rather live in a cottage with you than reign empress of the world without you." Interesting. Also in the 1690s, Anne's health was declining, and with repeated pregnancies, chronic illness took its toll. In her 30s she could barely walk, but was still forceful in politics, maintaining a separate court that rivalled William and Mary's, so much so that the sisters stopped speaking because Mary suspected Anne's bestie's husband, that John Churchill, of being a Jacobite. But in December 1694, Mary died of smallpox, and with no heir, William was forced to reconcile with Anne, who had the strongest claim to the throne. In July 1700, Anne's son, William, died of smallpox, just aged 11, so the heir to the Stuart dynasty was lost, and her personal tragedy changed our history. The Act of Settlement in 1701 secured the heirs to the throne as the Hanoverians, descendants of James I, which meant that George Ludwig of Hanover, who we mentioned before as a suitor for Anne, would be the next king. Anne and William set out this succession to secure the throne because they had no wish of Anne's half-brother, or that pretender brother, James, to take the throne after her father died the same year. They couldn't risk it going back to him. Impressively, Anne never let George visit England during her reign in case his presence threatened her power, but she still secured the inheritance of the crown for him. In March of 1702, King William died after a riding accident, and Anne became queen. The country's politics was becoming dominated by Whigs and Tories, and the country was involved in a war in Europe, so she had a lot to deal with, of course. In her first speech in Parliament, she showed her commitment to a Protestant succession, emphasising her own Englishness and critiquing the previous king's Dutchness. In a good public speech, surprising of a very shy person. Bishop Gilbert Burnet, who was there, said she pronounced this, as she did with all her other speeches, with great weight and authority. Quite impressive for a shy person. She proved to be a hard-working and popular monarch, despite it initially being believed she was too weak to be an effective queen due to the rise of Lady Sarah, giving the impression that she was ruled over by her favourite. During the War of the Spanish Succession, the Whigs, including Lady Sarah, supported the British involvement, whereas the Tories didn't, and with them gaining the power in the politics, they contributed to ending the war in 1713. Remember, at this point, politics are becoming a lot more significant, with Whigs supporting a limited monarchy that worked with Parliament, and the Tories wanting the power of the Church's religious status symbol, a battle that had ended the last few kings' reigns. In 1707, Anne supported the Acts of Union, which united the Crown of England and Scotland into one country. A year later, her half-brother James landed in Scotland with a French fleet, but failed to take Anne's crown. Her husband George died in 1708, which of course devastated Anne, and actually worsened her friendship with Sarah. The relationship was already becoming getting difficult with politics, but Sarah insisted Anne left the vigil by her husband's body, which realistically, yes, she should have done, but being made to do it before she was ready by Sarah was an intrusive action that further divided their friendship, as she kept trying to control and undermine the Queen while she was mourning, and understandably Anne had had enough. We also at this point have the entrance of Sarah's cousin, Abigail Hill, later Masham, who was married to George's groom of the bedchamber and friends of the politician Robert Harley, who was a political rival to the Marlboroughs. She began as a servant, dressing and waiting on the Queen, but soon became a close friend. The plot thickens. Their power struggle is very real and important for politics at the time, because England was of course very divided between the Whigs and the Tories, as we've said. Sarah had had a lot of titles bestowed upon her by Anne, and I think she was just a bit nasty always, considering she convinced Anne to burn the letters she had sent to her. It was like she had always planned to claim Anne's adoration was one-sided, and we'll never really know if Sarah had responded in the same way. I reckon she definitely did, because she's a manipulator. They started to grow apart due to politics and Sarah's domineering behaviour, whereas Abigail, instated as woman of the bedchamber in 1704, offered no argument or judgment towards the Queen. By 1708, it's thought Abigail had definitely become the favourite over Sarah. In April 1710, Anne and Sarah have their last horrid argument, where Anne refused to answer Sarah and said anything she had to say could be put in writing. So Sarah blackmailed the Queen, having kept all the letters of their correspondence as Mrs. Morley and Mrs. Freeman, as I mentioned a second ago, whereas Anne had destroyed them. She threatened to publish them, and she had her political allies spread rumours that Anne and Abigail's relationship was physical, ensuring history's view of Anne would forever be the story she made up or emphasised. I don't have the knowledge to tell you either way, since this is just a roundup of her life, not a deep dive. Historians did say about the film The Favourite, though, that it was unlikely Anne had relations with either woman, since she was devoted to her husband and shared his bed. She was also apparently quite the prude because of her strong faith, so that doubled with her poor health would hardly make her want to have affairs with women. As for the passion in the letters, female friendships writing to each other like that were not unusual for the time. It's just become a conflict and a controversy because she was the Queen and Sarah used them as blackmail. On the 30th of July 1714, Anne had several strokes. Doctors treated her with bleeding, blistering, hot irons and garlic on her feet, which of course just caused the already dying Queen even more pain. So the Privy Council got George over to England ASAP, and on the 1st of August, Anne died. Interestingly, after Anne died, Abigail was accused of stealing the Queen's jewels, but Sarah said, "I believe Lady Marsham never robbed anyone but me," an unlikely source of support for Abigail. Sarah published her memoirs, of course, meaning her tales are at the forefront of history when discussing Anne. She lived a long life, and as Duchess of Marlborough, actually became the richest woman in England, and one of the richest in the world. And she boasts a lineage including William Churchill and Princess Diana Spencer. Anne left no obvious will. Maybe her fears of death stopped her signing one. She created the United Kingdom as we know it, and paved the way for the Hanoverians, the dynasty of the Georgians that would rule until Victorian times. After her, monarchs would not rule with the divine right of kings, the belief that killed her grandfather, Charles I, and instead she worked with the new kind of monarchy, where they ruled in conjunction with Parliament, a legacy that's lasted until today, and a reign that should be more well known. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video, or follow the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.